A few hours ago, we concluded the 8th session for A Season for All Things, the campaign that I'm running in Google Hangouts for RuneQuest 6. And because the last video recap was for sessions 1 to 4, I figured it was time to do another one. So what has happened since? When we left in the previous recap, the characters had just made their discoveries in the underground temple they discovered and realized that they were somehow compelled to stand up in defense of their world. Now, part of what this is mechanically, of course, is that RuneQuest 6 incorporates something called passions, whereby the player and the game master can gauge the strength or the intensity of commitment or emotional reaction to something in the character's life. This could be, a form of patriotism. It could be a relationship between characters. It could be a hatred of something, that sort of thing. And after what they learned about their ancient enemy that they had known nothing about, that their cultures had forgotten or ignored for so long it had dwindled into insignificance, when they were truly shown what was coming back, they developed a strong passion to do something about it. So, what happened next? So the first thing that they did was to set a course for the Temple of Ascension. Now, this wasn't as easy as it sounds, because they really weren't sure where they were due to the nature of the cataclysm which had affected the desert around them. They really could have been anywhere inside its vast expanse. But there were some geographic features which, unless they too had been moved or distorted in some way by the cataclysm, might lead them to a ruined city. And this city was one of the primary landmarks used to navigate across the desert for this pilgrimage. So they gave it a try, and their last remaining nomadic guide, Vike, successfully guided them across the Diamond Sands to reach this ruin. Now, in the last recap, I just realized, or just remembered, that I kept referring to it as a glass desert. It's not glass, it's diamond, although the imagery is similar. So, once they reached the ruins, their intentions shifted suddenly, and the characters thought that they should investigate the ruins looking for signs of these other temples. They knew that they needed to find more clues, perhaps to the nature or the identity of the other stones, or what had happened to the the priests and warriors who were protecting the stones, and they really didn't know where any of these temples might be. So this ruin seemed like as good a place to start as any. Well, their investigations went against the advice of one of their primary protectors. And, well, he turned out to be right. In one of the most brutal combats that we've experienced so far, the group had to retreat or perish. And while they were more capable of dealing harm against this particular opponent, a spiritual opponent, than maybe a different group of characters would have been, they still just barely escaped with their lives, and weeks later are still carrying injuries, and Goran will be carrying injuries related to this encounter for the rest of his life. So it was a very serious situation, wherein they discovered nothing about their particular quest, but of course learned more about morality and learned more about the world that their cultures have forgotten. This ruin, it turns out, was an ancient plinth ruin from the time when they still lived on the surface, and it could be one of the locations where Plinth himself may have come down to make his pronouncement sentencing his worshippers to a subterranean life of service as the first line of defenders against the foul creatures of chaos, those that lurk beneath the world. Maybe not. But standing in that place, it was believable. And our Plinthan character, Turgid, was able to recognize a lot and share a lot about how the temples were arranged and how the streets were lined up in the art and that sort of thing. So they knew it was an incredibly ancient location, but ancient enough to contain clues about these temples that they weren't so sure about. Well, taking the survivors, the captain of the Order of the Horizon, the mercenary group that's protecting them, he resumed the trail for the Temple of Ascension. But it wasn't long before the guide, Vike, noticed that they were losing water rapidly. And so he had to separate from the group in order to replenish it. And finding water in the desert is not an impossible task, but it is a very specific one. And he decided he could probably handle it better moving quickly by himself on horseback than taking the whole caravan into uncharted territory where things were definitely stirred up after the cataclysm. So Vike was expected back within the day. He didn't return. More time passed. They're not really sure how much time. They've completely lost track of it. Partly because the sun doesn't move. The light level never changes, and they don't have anything like, clocks. But also partly because of some other effect that's going on, as if time itself wasn't really flowing the way that it used to, at least not for them. And so once they had decided that he was well and truly lost, they had a decision to make. How are they going to find water without the skill that Vike had to find it? And how are they going to continue to navigate successfully without an experienced guide like Vike? So, Gorwyn, Turgid, and one of the members of the Order of the Horizon took the 3 horses that they had available, and they followed his back trail. Which led them into some interesting adventures. During these adventures, they learned more about how to survive in the desert. They worked with Callum, an experienced rider, in becoming more proficient in riding themselves. Now, they had enough skill to handle the day-to-day pressures of riding at a reasonable pace across relatively flat terrain. They did not have the skill necessary to manage the temperament of the horses, to make sure that they were eating properly, and to reassure them that the person in the saddle was the person truly in control. So as they journeyed, they worked together to keep each other safe, and Callum shared with them insight into how to look for the many predators which might find them appealing, moving at the slow rate of speed that they needed to do, and in the small number that they had. The heavy wagons with the bison, and lots of noise, and lots of available eyes and guards, these are sufficient to keep away most of the small and medium predators, even the ones that attack in packs. But 3 men traveling slowly by horseback could definitely be being followed. So, after some difficult moments of tracking and interpersonal communication, where they needed to really to establish some rapport about, being forthcoming with all details, like, I don't know where I'm going. They did find Vike in a bad way. They found his horse injured. They found him punched through the abdomen and clearly suffering from some kind of venomous bite, bitten by something of great proportions, which was still lurking around. And it wasn't long before they found themselves engaged with a giant centipede, some 40 feet in length. And they battled it desperately, and they took it down, working together with teamwork, relying on each other to be there, and focusing on each person's special skills. Gorwin, the unarmed mystic warrior, leapt right in, got on the thing's head, and started, pounding and pounding away at it, pulling out its eye stalks, and reaching into its cranium to mess with its state of mind. Meanwhile, Callum is invoking spells to debilitate the creature, and Turgid is there, sword and shield in hand, facing it head on. And between the three of them, they took it down without anyone being injured. And they celebrated like you wouldn't believe, and became quite boastful about it. And it was an accomplishment of which they should have been proud. And they were able to administer successful aid to Vike, and his horse pulled through on his own. And they began the slow trip back to rejoin the caravan, where the potential dangers magnified. They had an injured man on a less than stable injured horse, and they were moving even more slowly as a result, and they themselves were growing more and more fatigued, so more likely to make mistakes. The fatigue system in RuneQuest, much like the passions system, these work really well together to bring out that kind of natural ebb and flow that that we experience as we get worn down by the difficulty of what it is we're trying to accomplish, but then at the same time, what we're trying to accomplish and our desire to do it, our passion for it, pulls us back out of the pit. And it was very satisfying to have a relatively mundane trip where they had to ride across the desert, track Vike, find him, deal with the threat, and then try and make their way back, turned this into much more than just a series of disassociated rolls. Like, okay, give me a ride roll and see if you succeed. It was much more than that. It was character growth. It was an exploration of who these characters had been and who they were becoming, what was now taking a preeminent position in their lives. And as the game master, that was really quite rewarding. And I hope for the players it was something special too. Even though there were numerous occasions where they almost ended up as something's lunch. There was the giant centipede. There was the very fierce insect swarm, which really would have been the death of them had they not had access to magic. Plain and simple. Then there was the attack by one of the lurkers, which we've described before. The man-sized, eyeless pack predators, which attack brutally with a large bite, a penetrating tongue that injects a necrotizing poison. They had a terrible brush with one of those in which they lost Turgid's horse, and so now their pace was even slower. But as each level of adversity was piled onto the characters, they rose to the challenge. Sometimes, luck points had to be spent to undo a truly tragic roll, and sometimes the players decided to go with these bad rolls. and because they felt, I think, that they were deserved. Our characters are not terribly skilled in all of these things that are required of them now, and we would be making mistakes. So yeah, I'm going to let that ride. Now, luck is a finite resource in RuneQuest, and so that, I'm sure, played a part in their decision, but the events had a very natural feel to them. And so as I said, as adversity mounted, they took more and more precautions, and I felt like the characters were really learning more and more about survival in this awful desert. And eventually, they got to within striking distance of where they believed the wagons to be. And they stumbled across a route. During one of Vic's moments of consciousness, he struggled with a bleeding wound throughout the journey. During one of his moments of consciousness, they discovered this root, which, when boiled properly, which Vike was able to do, was a restorative. And this was a way that they began to climb back out of the fatigue well. The root acted as a stimulant. Now, what he didn't tell them, or perhaps didn't know, was that it also serves as a mental stimulant. So as they rested, they had visions, and as is their habit, they discussed their dreams and visions, and they discovered that they had all had the same dream and the same vision, and that it was of, well, the complete destruction of the Phaedron main city. And this is the sentient race which lives beneath the ocean. They're seafarers, but protected, almost, as they say, nestled in the palm of their god. They have this massive, beautiful, artistically intense city beneath the waves. And our characters, in their vision, watched as the protective barrier, shell, which keeps the waters at bay, collapsed. And with their perspective changing from different points of view all throughout the city, they watched, heard, and felt people drown again and again and again and again. And when they were finally released from the vision, they had very little to no doubt that this was an event which had actually happened. What made this even more poignant for them was that as they were dealing with the giant centipede, and as they were preparing to make their way back to the caravan, they had witnessed far in the distance one of the cloud cities of the Allyrans, the sentient race that's mostly insubstantial, winged people that dwell in the clouds, watched one of their cities slowly transform into what looked to their eyes far, far away as stone and fall out of the sky. And they felt the tremors as it impacted. And again, leaving very little hope that there were survivors. So what was happening in their world? These questions were racing all the time. And as we crossed the desert, their moments of roleplay were centered around day-to-day survival and survival of their world. So they make it back to the wagons and discover that things haven't been easy there either. The caravan had been attacked by strange beings that live in the wastes, who were ostensibly human but had been warped, according to the witnesses, warped by chaos and beyond all reason. And Eastrel, using his sorceress magic, in the end had to invoke a very powerful spell and kill them all or drive them away. And those that were left, there were two who were still alive, were tortured for information, then strung up as thieves on makeshift crosses, and left as a warning not to mess with them again. And there were deaths. One of the younger pilgrims was carried off by a lurker, and the old pilgrim was slain ultimately slain by the attack of raiders, but his death was assured by having encountered something beneath the sand which had poisoned him. The rise of venomous creatures in the desert seems to the pilgrims to be connected to the chaotic events around them, but for those who have traveled in the desert before, it's just a part of its own ecosystem. Everything is out to kill you. Once reunited, and stories had been swapped and boasts had been made, including a very funny scene where the very taciturn Turgid was in point form detailing their adventures, punctuated by the incredibly explicit and not necessarily accurate, but very hyperbolic Gorwin's additions to his tale. This role-played recap of their adventure was hilarious. And once they had gotten all this out of the way, they resumed their journey. And Gorwin needed the time to heal, and Turgid needed the time to heal, and Wakefield needed time to heal, and as did Eastrel and Pelor, one of the other order members. So they take it slow across the desert, mounting careful watches, and manage to get all the way to the Temple of Ascension without incident. And when they arrive, they're waved in, and expecting to be met, they are disappointed that no one is there to greet them, although business as usual seems to be happening around the temple. And the temple itself is very much like a city-state, and as they travel for about a day from its walled border into the interior, the giant temple is growing closer and closer all the time, and in the fields, the lush fields around them, carved out of the desolate diamond dust of the desert, they see workers harvesting fruit and harvesting vegetables and harvesting grains, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of rush or emergency preparation. There don't seem to be soldiers in the fields, just in their regular patrol points, and no one seems to be particularly concerned, although they have had many weeks to adjust to any concern they may have felt. But it's a hard-working, very serious, very beautiful place. Finally, as they almost reach the temple, they are greeted by a very small contingent of priests who welcome them warmly and explain what's about to happen, and that they are going to meet the highest priests, and these would be the most revered priests in the known world. They're given time to refresh themselves, and then they are asked to stand before the patriarch and tell of their journey. Of course, they forego any of this "I'm a pilgrim from the far off reaches of the known world," and relate the tragedy of the last few weeks, some of which is of course known to the people of the temple, but many of the important details are not. And this of course sparks an uprising. They're taken away and interviewed, or as they put it, interrogated separately. Their stories are checked, and then they're brought back together to wait for some kind of decision from the High Council of Priests. And while they're waiting, Gorwin has been growing more and more suspicious. Everything seems natural and normal according to Eastrel, but even he's not willing to surrender his weapons and relax as he has been bid. And one nice thing about this temple is that it doesn't force itself on anyone. You can have the religious and unreligious alike. You can have people wandering around expecting the temple guards to care for them, and so carrying no weapons or armor, and then you can have fully armed and armored, very suspicious desert travelers walking around, and it doesn't raise an eyebrow, although in that latter case you do get followed by the temple guards. So, all together in a room, Gorwin is going nuts. He has this itch in the back of his mind, like he knows something is wrong. And while they're served wine, it just so happens that they notice something peculiar, as if from somewhere a droplet has been added to the wine. Like there might be someone invisibly in the room with them, and Turgid gets the bright idea to cast his wine across the tabletop, and he catches in a silhouette of spattering wine droplets someone tightly wrapped up in leather, carrying all these different pouches with a hood over their face, who appears standing on the table, who has obviously just tried to poison Eastrel. The others are holding their goblets, and so perhaps were not accessible. A person becomes visible, and combat ensues, and they quickly realize, one, the person is not male, it's female, and two, the person is not a person. As the attack goes on, another one attacks from hiding, revealing there are two. Wakefield gets stabbed in the back and begins this desperate struggle, neither one of them able to land a blow. And Turgid rushes to his aid, and the two of them are finding it very difficult to take this one out. Gorwin and Eastrel focus on the other, and as they combine to bring it down, the one with Wakefield and Turgid spits a cloud of acidic venom, which sears into Wakefield's flesh, causing incredible pain and distraction, and eating into Turgid's shield, and they redouble their efforts. Gorwin leaves Eastrel and rushes to their aid, and the three of them manage to take it down. And this was a pretty quick combat, and there were critical rolls on both sides, and lots of interesting special effects involved, called shots to specific locations, forcing surrender and disarmament, and lots of cool stuff. So it was a fun little combat, at the end of which they had two live captives who had been forced into surrender, and so were somewhat predisposed to believe that if they didn't talk and spill their secrets, they would be killed. And to be able to get there, not just by waving my hand and have it be narratively true, but having the players be able to create this mechanically, so that none of our hands were on it. It wasn't a point expenditure, he confesses, or it wasn't, GM Fiat. They beat their opponents. The opponents had a reaction, fear, and the opponents were then more easily interrogated for what they knew. Very satisfying. So, what did they know? Well, they didn't share much before, the Grand High priests of the temple showed up and wanted to interrogate them themselves. But they did learn a different perspective on this war. The non-humans, who were, in fact, some form of humanoid lizard, no tails, no scales, but fangs and the ability to spit venom, regarded them as invaders, claiming that the world was theirs and they had been misplaced by invaders. And they're filled with hatred for the humans and the Plenton standing before them. And later, as the priests came in, the two Plenthons conferred, Turgid and one of the high priests. And they recalled a myth from their past, and they speculated that these were descendants of a human group which had split away from the forces of law and had joined the forces of chaos and had received this transformation as a part of their reward for service to chaos, chaos always being unpredictable. So, as we left this session, they had time alone with the Patriarch to discuss their calling, as perhaps the first ones called to a grand quest, and what they were going to do about this quest. And he offered his suggestions that maybe they were being called to recruit and to prepare the way for the forces of law to take this battle to the forces of chaos, which clearly had the advantage. The characters asked permission to enter the temple's library and begin to investigate for the clues that would help them find the temples, to understand the stones, and understand their very ancient enemy. What's going to happen next?